Welcome back. Tonight I want to talk about a word that gets thrown at this teaching more often than almost any. Other. Delusion. Someone hears that you're deliberately assuming a state that doesn't yet match your visible circumstances, and the accusation comes quickly and confidently. You're lying to yourself. You're avoiding reality. You're building a fantasy to hide from facts you don't want to face. It's a serious charge, and it deserves a serious, thorough answer, rather than a defensive or dismissive one. Neville Goddard heard this particular accusation throughout his entire teaching life. Repeatedly. From skeptics, and sometimes from sincere seekers who simply hadn't, here the train, yet understood the distinction properly. And he never dismissed it lightly or brushed it aside. He met it directly, because he understood something most critics of this teaching consistently miss. There's a real, structural difference between delusion and creation, and the difference isn't or clever wordplay designed to dodge the criticism. It's a difference in direction, in relationship to evidence, and in what the assumed state is actually being used for underneath the surface. Confusing the two isn't just an intellectual error made by outside critics. It's often what keeps sincere people from ever taking this teaching seriously enough to properly test it for themselves. And it's also what occasionally lets a genuine practitioner drift, without noticing, from creation into something considerably less healthy. Tonight we're going to walk through this carefully and completely. What delusion actually is, in both the clinical and the everyday sense, and how it differs structurally from a deliberately assumed state. Why the accusation of delusion usually says more about the observer's own relationship to reality than it says about the person doing the assuming. How to tell, honestly and without flinching, whether you've personally crossed from creation into denial at some point. What role facts and evidence genuinely play in this practice. Since Neville never once asked anyone to pretend the physical world doesn't exist around them. And why, in the end, what looks like delusion from the outside is very often simply someone declining to let the present moment have the final, permanent word over everything that comes after it. This is a long one tonight. Get settled, and let's begin properly. What delusion actually is? To make this distinction properly and honestly, we have to start with a clear, careful definition of delusion itself, rather than using the word loosely, the way it usually gets thrown around in casual conversation or online debate. A delusion, properly understood, is a fixed belief that persists in direct contradiction to available evidence, and that the person holding it either cannot or will not examine, even when given the genuine opportunity to. The key defining feature isn't simply that the belief happens to be false. Plenty of false beliefs aren't delusions at all. They're just ordinary mistakes, waiting patiently to be corrected once better information eventually arrives. The key defining feature is the fixedness of it, the imperviousness to any real examination. A person in the grip of a genuine delusion doesn't merely disagree with the evidence sitting in front of them. They're often unable to engage with it meaningfully at all, because the belief has stopped functioning as an idea genuinely open to revision, and started functioning instead as a wall, protecting them from having to confront something else entirely underneath it. Delusion also tends to be static rather than directional in nature. It doesn't actually point anywhere forward. It doesn't ask anything further of the person holding it, beyond simply being maintained day after day without change. It's a fixed defensive position, defended rather than genuinely built upon, and it typically leaves the person holding it more isolated from their actual circumstances over time, rather than more capable of meaningfully engaging with them. Compare this now, carefully, to what Neville actually taught throughout his lectures. An assumed state, properly practiced, is never meant to be a fixed, permanent denial of present circumstances. It's a deliberately chosen inner position, held with full, clear awareness of the current facts, aimed at changing those facts over time, through a lawful, if largely invisible, process. It isn't static in the way delusion is. It's directional, oriented clearly toward an outcome, meant to actively shape what comes next, rather than simply insulating the person from what already currently is. And crucially, it doesn't require ignoring the present facts in order to function. It requires holding a genuinely different assumption about the future within the very same mind that remains fully, clearly aware of the present. This is the first and most important distinction to hold on to. Delusion denies reality and stops there entirely, going no further. Assumption acknowledges reality fully and then moves through it towards something else altogether. Direction is the difference here. A way to make this genuinely concrete rather than leaving it abstract. Imagine two people, each facing an equally difficult financial situation, bills stacking up steadily, an uncertain income stream, real and pressing stress about exactly how the next month is going to unfold for them. The first person copes with this situation by insisting, out loud and to anyone who happens to be listening, that there's actually no problem at all, that the bills simply don't matter, that money has never been a genuine concern for them personally, that everything is already perfectly fine exactly as it currently stands. They avoid opening the mail entirely. They avoid checking the account balance whenever possible. They construct, piece by careful piece, a version of the present moment that simply excludes the specific parts they don't whose. Atkinson's. This is delusion in the fullest clinical sense. A static, ongoing refusal to engage honestly with what's actually happening, maintained entirely through avoidance rather than through any real inner transformation taking place underneath. The second person handles the exact same set of external circumstances quite differently from the first. They know precisely what the account balance currently says, down to the last figure. They open the mail promptly. They're fully, clearly aware of the specific numbers involved, without flinching away from any of them. But alongside that clear, unflinching awareness, they've deliberately chosen to assume a genuinely different underlying state, not there is no problem here at all, but rather, I am someone for whom this particular kind of problem gets resolved, even in cases where I don't yet see exactly how that resolution will come about. They feel their way carefully into the specific relief of the matter being handled, not by denying the current numbers sitting in front of them, but by simply refusing to let those numbers alone be the final, permanent word on what's still genuinely possible for them going forward from here. The external situation, in the immediate moment, is entirely identical for both of these people. The first person's approach is delusion, a wall built carefully out of ongoing denial. The second person's approach is creation, a state deliberately assumed in full, clear view of the facts, aimed specifically at changing them over time. The difference was never actually about whether either person acknowledged the numbers in front of them. It was entirely about what each of them chose to do with their own inner state once those numbers had already been clearly and honestly acknowledged. Why the accusation gets made so often? It's worth understanding honestly why this particular accusation of delusion comes up so frequently and so quickly, and whenever this teaching gets discussed openly in public settings, because the underlying reason isn't always quite what it first appears to be on the surface. Most people have been trained, often without ever consciously choosing it for themselves, to treat present circumstances as the final and complete authority on what's to be genuinely real and what remains possible going forward. Within that particular frame of reference, Anyone who assumes a state that doesn't yet match their visible circumstances looks, on the surface at least, essentially indistinguishable from someone caught in denial. The outside observer simply doesn't have direct access to what's fully why, whether they're fully, clearly aware of the facts and choosing a considered directional response from that awareness, or whether they're avoiding the facts entirely through active denial. From the outside looking in, both postures can look remarkably similar in any given moment. Someone speaking with real confidence about an outcome that hasn't actually happened yet. This is a genuinely fair and understandable source of confusion, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than simply dismissing it out of hand. The two inner states really can look quite alike from a distance, especially in the earlier stages of a practice, before any outer confirmation has clearly arrived either way to settle the question. The honest answer to this accusation, when it comes, isn't to get defensive about it or dig in reflexively, but to be genuinely clear, first in your own mind and often in your own words, when the moment naturally calls for it, about which of the two states you're actually practicing at that time. Someone caught in genuine denial usually can't articulate the current facts accurately when asked directly about them. Someone genuinely practicing assumption typically can do exactly that, in real detail. You will simply add afterward, and here is what I'm nonetheless choosing to hold alongside those facts going forward. There's also a somewhat deeper reason this particular accusation tends to surface so reflexively and so quickly, one genuinely worth naming honestly here. A person who has fully, quietly accepted that present circumstances represent the final word on what's possible, often finds it genuinely uncomfortable to watch someone else openly refuse that same underlying premise. It implicitly raises a question they may not particularly want to sit with themselves. If circumstances truly aren't the final word after all, what might that mean about all the various circumstances they're already quietly accepted as permanent and unchangeable in their own life? Calling the other person deluded can be, whether consciously intended or not, a convenient way of protecting that comfortable, settled premise from ever being genuinely disturbed or examined too closely. The role of evidence in this practice. It's worth being genuinely direct here about something Neville himself was consistently direct about across his many lectures. This teaching was never actually an argument against evidence, facts, or the physical world in any meaningful sense. He wasn't asking anyone, ever, to pretend the visible world simply doesn't exist around them, or that ordinary circumstances don't matter at all in any practical, everyday sense. What he was actually pointing to instead is a specific, careful claim about the underlying relationship between consciousness and evidence, namely, that evidence is downstream of assumption rather than the other way around. Present facts are treated, under his teaching, not as unchangeable, as summing final verdicts, but as a kind of delayed report on assumptions that were genuinely held earlier, sometimes considerably earlier than the facts themselves finally appeared. This means facts remain fully real and genuinely worth acknowledging clearly and honestly, but they're not treated as fixed forever simply because they happen to be currently true today, in this particular moment. This distinction matters enormously for understanding clearly why the practice isn't too delusional in the clinical sense at all, properly understood. A person practicing genuine denial treats today's facts as though they don't exist in the first place. A person practicing genuine assumption treats today's facts as real, current, and accurately, honestly observed, while also holding, at the very same time, that facts, unlike delusions, remain genuinely subject to change over time as the underlying assumption itself gradually shifts. The facts aren't being denied in any way. They're being understood instead as provisional rather than final and fixed, which represents an entirely different epistemic position than outright denial altogether. It's worth adding here, clearly, that this teaching was never meant to replace ordinary, sensible engagement with practical, everyday reality either. Someone genuinely practicing assumption about their financial circumstances doesn't simply stop paying attention to their actual account balance, doesn't stop taking whatever reasonable, sensible action remains available to them, doesn't that. Their obligations have somehow vanished simply because an inner state has shifted. Internally, the practical physical world still receives its full, appropriate attention throughout. What genuinely changes is the inner posture held alongside that ongoing attention, patient and directional in nature, rather than resigned and permanently fixed. An extended example: the diagnosis and the two responses. Let me walk through a considerably more difficult example now, because health circumstances tend to bring this particular distinction into unusually sharp focus, and it's genuinely worth handling with real care rather than glossing over it quickly. Imagine someone who has recently received a difficult diagnosis of some kind. There are, broadly speaking, two very different ways someone might respond to this kind of news while using language that superficially resembles this teaching. And it's genuinely important to distinguish clearly between them here. One response involves refusing to acknowledge the diagnosis at all in any meaningful way, declining appropriate medical care outright, insisting to friends and family that nothing is actually wrong with them, avoiding necessary follow-up appointments entirely, treating the whole situation as though simply speaking differently about it out loud will somehow make the underlying medical against reality disappear entirely on its own. This particular response, whatever borrowed language it happens to use to describe itself, is genuinely not what Neville ever taught. It's plain denial wearing the vocabulary of assumption as a kind of disguise, and it can be genuinely dangerous in practice, because it abandons appropriate, necessary practical action entirely in favor of pure avoidance. The other response involves fully and honestly acknowledging the diagnosis, engaging completely and cooperatively with appropriate medical care as it's offered, staying clearly and accurately informed about the actual physical situation as it develops over time, while also, alongside all of that ongoing engagement, deliberately cultivating an inner state of genuine expectancy toward healing, refusing to let the diagnosis alone author the entire remaining story before it's done, actually finished being written out. This particular person can state the diagnosis accurately and clearly to anyone who happens to ask them about it. They're not avoiding a single relevant fact. What they're consciously declining to do instead is treat today's diagnosis as an unchangeable, permanent verdict about tomorrow, and they're using the drowsy states and imaginal practices genuinely available to them alongside their actual medical treatment, not as any kind of substitute for it. This particular distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being genuinely unambiguous about it, precisely because the accusation of delusion is at its most serious, and sometimes at its most entirely fair, when it comes to matters exactly like this one. Genuine creation, properly and carefully practiced, was never meant to replace appropriate action in the physical world in any way. It was meant to be held alongside that action, quietly shaping the inner posture a person brings to it, never substituting for the action itself. Testing yourself honestly. Given how easily these two distinct states can be confused, even by the very person practicing them in good faith, it's genuinely worth having a few honest, practical questions you can ask yourself directly, rather than relying purely on good intentions alone to keep you reliably on the right side of this important distinction. The first question worth asking yourself: can I state the current facts of my situation clearly and accurately, without flinching away from any part of them? If someone happened to ask me to right now, without warning, someone genuinely practicing assumption can generally do this without much real difficulty at all. Someone quietly slipping into denial often finds this surprisingly hard to do, and typically notices a kind of internal resistance or vagueness arising the moment they actually try. The second question worth asking: is my assumed state genuinely leading me toward reasonable, sensible action that remains available to me, or is it instead being quietly used as a phony, convenient reason to avoid action that would otherwise clearly and obviously be called for? Genuine assumption tends to coexist quite naturally with appropriate, ongoing engagement in the physical world. Denial, by contrast, tends to use the borrowed language of this practice specifically as a justification for avoiding that same necessary engagement altogether. The third question worth asking: am I genuinely able to hold this assumed state with a sense of quiet, settled ease, or does it instead require constant, effortful defending whenever the current facts happen to come up naturally in conversation with others? Denial tends to feel notably brittle under any real examination, requiring active, energetic defense every single time reality happens to intrude on it from outside. Genuine assumption, by contrast, tends to feel considerably steadier and calmer under the same kind of scrutiny, able to acknowledge contrary facts openly without feeling seriously threatened by them, precisely because it was never actually built on ignoring those particular facts in the first place. None of these three questions are meant to introduce anxious, constant self-monitoring into a practice that just only supposed to bring real peace rather than additional vigilance and worry. They're meant instead as an occasional, honest check-in, something worth returning to every so often when it feels relevant, not something to obsess over daily, simply to make sure the practice is still genuinely doing what it was always actually meant to do for you. Creation requires engagement. Delusion requires avoidance. Here's the way to summarize this entire distinction that's genuinely worth carrying forward as a simple, memorable test you can return to easily. Delusion is fundamentally a strategy of avoidance at its core. It exists specifically to keep certain facts from ever being looked at directly, and it depends entirely on that avoidance continuing indefinitely in order to survive intact. The moment avoidance genuinely breaks down, the moment the mail finally does get opened, the moment the difficult conversation finally does happen, the delusion tends to collapse, often quite suddenly and completely, because it was never actually built to withstand any direct contact with what it had been carefully avoiding all along. Creation, by clear contrast, is fundamentally a strategy of engagement, sustained deliberately over time. It doesn't depend on avoiding anything whatsoever. It can look directly and honestly at the current facts, name them plainly and without hesitation, and continue holding its directional assumption anyway, precisely because that assumption was never actually resting on ignorance of those facts to begin with. This is exactly why creation tends to be considerably more durable than delusion over the long, even though the two can look somewhat similar on the surface in any single, brief snapshot taken in isolation. Delusion is fragile under any real scrutiny. Creation remains stable under that same scrutiny because it was genuinely built to withstand examination from the very beginning, rather than built to hide from it entirely. If you ever find your own assumed state starting to feel noticeably fragile, if you notice yourself quietly avoiding certain conversations, certain pieces of information, certain honest check-ins with yourself because they feel genuinely threatening to maintain the state you're currently holding, that's genuinely worth pausing on directly. It may well be a sign that the practice has quietly drifted, without your full awareness, from creation towards something considerably closer to denial. And the appropriate corrective move here isn't to defend the fragile state even more forcefully than before. It's to return fully to honest, complete engagement with the current facts as they stand, and then deliberately re-choose the assumed state again, this time in full, clear view of those facts, rather than in spite of them. What the critics usually miss, it's genuinely worth addressing the substance of the delusion accusation directly, one more time, because there's a version of this critique that deserves a genuinely serious, considered answer, rather than simple dismissal out of hand. The strongest version of this particular critique tends to go something like this. Isn't it simply more honest, more genuinely psychologically healthy to accept things to exactly as they currently are, rather than insisting on holding an inner state that actively contradicts present circumstances? Isn't straightforward acceptance the mature, grounded response here? And isn't this entire teaching, at bottom, really just a refusal of acceptance, dressed up carefully in spiritual-sounding language? This genuinely deserves a real, considered answer, and the answer itself hinges on a distinction that most critics consistently and genuinely miss. Accepting present circumstances as real and accurately, honestly observed, is not remotely the same thing as accepting them as permanent and entirely unchangeable going forward. Neville's teaching doesn't actually ask anyone, at any point, to reject the first, healthier kind of acceptance, full, clear-eyed acknowledgement of exactly what's currently true in front of them. It asks people instead to reject only the second, more limiting kind, the quiet, often entirely unexamined assumption that today's circumstances automatically represent the final word on tomorrow's simply because no visible alternative has happened to appear just yet. This is a genuinely important distinction to hold on to clearly, because a great deal of what commonly passes for mature acceptance in ordinary, everyday life is actually this second, considerably more limiting kind, treating a current fact as though it permanently forecloses all future possibility entirely, without the person ever actually testing carefully whether that assumption is even true. Neville's teaching isn't a refusal of the first, genuinely healthier kind of acceptance at all. It's a specific, deliberate refusal of only the second kind, and that particular refusal, properly and fully understood, isn't any kind of psychological weakness whatsoever. It's actually closer to the opposite of weakness, a genuine willingness to hold present difficulty honestly and fully, while simultaneously declining to let it write the entire remaining story in advance, before it's even had the chance to unfold. Living the distinction day-to-day trees. So how does all of this genuinely translate into an actual daily practice, something you can genuinely carry forward with you rather than simply agreeing with intellectually tonight and then quietly setting aside by tomorrow? Whenever you notice yourself assuming a state that doesn't yet fully match your current circumstances, pause briefly and check in honestly with yourself. Am I still fully aware of the current facts as they stand? Or have I quietly, gradually stopped looking at them clearly? If you find you can still state the facts plainly and accurately, you're very likely still practicing genuine creation rather than denial. And there's genuinely no need for further anxiety about the distinction in that moment. If instead you notice you're quietly stop being able to look at certain facts clearly and directly, that's genuinely worth gently addressing, not by abandoning the assumed state your president's died. You've been building, but by returning fully to honest engagement with the present circumstances first, and then deliberately re-choosing your assumption from that more honest starting point. When someone else challenges your assumed state by pointing directly to your present circumstances, resist the natural urge to argue that those circumstances aren't real or somehow don't matter at all. Instead, you can simply acknowledge them plainly and calmly. Yes, that's entirely accurate. That's genuinely where things currently stand. And then simply add, calmly and without any particular need to convince them of anything further, that you've got your negotiations. But then we tell nonetheless choosing to hold a different assumption about what comes next from here. This isn't any kind of rejection of their honest observation. It's a clear, calm statement of what you're actually doing with that observation, and it tends to be a considerably more stable position to hold over time than getting drawn into arguing about whether the current facts are even real in the first place. And throughout all of this, keep consistently returning to the practical, reasonable actions genuinely available to you in the present moment, the same actions any sensible person would naturally take regardless of their particular inner state at the time. The assumed state was never meant to replace those necessary actions at any point. It was always meant to be the quiet, settled inner posture you bring to them as you carry them out. So here is what I genuinely want to leave you with tonight. What looks like delusion from the outside is very often something else entirely, someone fully and honestly aware of exactly where they currently stand, who has simply, deliberately declined to let that particular position be the final word on where they're zen, eventually, ultimately going. That's not avoidance in any meaningful sense. That's not denial. That's a deliberate, directional choice, made in full, clear view of the facts rather than in spite of them, or in ignorance of them. The real test here was never whether your assumed state happens to match today's circumstances exactly. Of course it very often won't, at least not yet. The real, honest test is whether you can still look directly and clearly at those circumstances, name them fully and honestly to yourself and to others, and hold your chosen assumption alongside them without ever needing to hide from either one of them. That's the entire difference between building a wall and building a bridge. One protects you from ever having to look at anything further. The other is genuinely how you eventually get somewhere you haven't actually been yet. Tonight, if there's an area of your own life where you've been quietly assuming something genuinely different from what your current circumstances might suggest, take a moment to honestly check yourself against everything we've covered here. If you find you can state the present facts clearly and still hold your chosen state with real, you're not deluding yourself in any way. You're doing exactly what Neville actually taught throughout his life, looking reality fully, and honestly in the face, and calmly, deliberately refusing, without any denial at all, to let it have the very last word. This has been the Neville Archive. I'll see you in the next one.